2022 has been an interesting year, to put it lightly. As far as the channel's concerned, I feel like I might have finally hit the starting line, despite being around for a few years now. My output, while obviously not as frequent or consistent as I'd like, is still a far cry from how I started out creating content. Thanks to some much appreciated holiday assistance, I've even gotten to the point where I'm happy with most of the equipment at my disposal, as opposed to the snowball I'd been using previously. And to top it all off, the one year that I chose to pick up the pace in was the one that made the game responsible for the channel's visual inspiration relevant again, and gave me more of a reason to talk about it. I started out by reviewing a Battle Network spiritual successor 2 years ago, to questionable results. My second most viewed video this year was a discussion about the prospect of the series returning, and just 2 months later, my wish came true and then some. But that's enough rambling about the channel itself. In this video, as I've done previously, I'll be looking back at the games that I played this year and giving you my general thoughts on them. This gives me an excuse to talk about titles that I otherwise wouldn't feel inclined to make videos on, or even ones that I just haven't gotten around to yet. But they also allow me to look back on titles that I did cover, and see how my opinions of them have changed, if at all. I'll be sticking to games that have released in 2022, and going in mostly chronological order, with one exception which you'll see at the very end. So with all the groundwork finally laid, and all formalities appropriately dispensed of, it's time to get started. This is a look back and review of my gaming in 2022. Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel is a game that, for all intents and purposes, should have been a disaster waiting to happen. Konami had already made a previous foray into pay-to-win heavy gacha games with Duel Links, and the average asking price of a Tier 1 TCG deck hovers around $500,000 after they, shift around some pull ratios and swap around some rarities. So all the evidence pointed to the idea that Yu-Gi-Oh's Dream Simulator would just be as money-hungry and inaccessible as all other avenues that aren't named Dueling Book or YGO Pro. And yet, inexplicably, Master Duel managed to not only beat those allegations, but it reintroduced me to modern Yu-Gi-Oh! In a way that doesn't just make it digestible, it makes it genuinely enjoyable. And as someone who is effectively forced to avoid locals like the literal plague, that means a lot more to me than you might realize. Master Duel isn't perfect, mind you. There's still a lot of degenerate shit that's legal because of the devs' insistence on MD's ban list being an OCG-TCG hybrid. Newer flagship archetypes come packing a dizzying amount of mandatory URs, effectively guaranteeing that you can't build every deck at once as a free-to-play player. And if you're one of those old school DM fans that just really wants to jam Blue Eyes in ranked, rest assured that Konami sees you, and will make you pay the corresponding Kaiba Corp tax. But as a casual fan that also doesn't shy away from the game's more modern facets, and who's willing to farm gems for a fun deck every now and again, Master Duel is everything I could ever ask for. The UI is clean, the level of automation for things like chains resolving makes the flow of a duel easy to follow, there's a wealth of cheap and accessible customization options, and the crafting system makes building the decks you want relatively simple. Last but not least, and this might be a bit of a hot take, but I love that ranked is best of one, even despite the lack of side decking. I understand that the lack of siding makes certain matchups a complete blowout. But since ranked is functionally a million-man locals already, you wouldn't be able to feasibly side for everything until you hit at least gold, if not higher. And that's without getting into how best of 3 would bring the pace of climbing ranked to a screeching halt. I hope that Master Duel continues to improve going forward, especially as far as banned lists are concerned, but I can't deny that I love it for giving me a safe, high-quality way to scratch that TCG itch, even if it comes at the cost of pay-per-play. Now, if only a certain other card game would look in Master Duel's general direction and take a hint. God, this game really did come out this year. Surely I'm not the only one that forgot, right? Though I suppose the difference there is that most people forget that Arceus released this year because it was all the way back in January. Whereas I tend to forget that it was released this year because I keep forgetting that it exists at all. And even when it does cross my mind, it's almost never because I'm looking back in a positive light. For many fans, Legends Arceus is a massive turning point in the mainline series that reinvented the wheel entirely for the better and is the new peak of Pokemon as a whole. Yet, to me, Legends Arceus is a glorified side game that's by no means bad, mostly, but I certainly wouldn't argue that it's the monumental paradigm shift that everyone thinks it is either. The revamped catching mechanics are genuinely fun to engage with. Until the thought of completing the game's abysmal Pokédex crosses your mind, Hisui has a decent amount of open areas that are enjoyable to explore. As long as you rush through the bare-bones story to unlock all the ride Pokemon, and as long as there isn't another much more ambitious feeling title with a larger scope, released in the same year. Oh, but this game has the best move management system the series has ever seen. And so does a much more ambitious feeling title with a larger scope that was released in the same year. Are we beginning to notice a trend here? In the same vein that Sword and Shield were $60 or $90, depending on your perspective, tech demos for Arceus, Arceus is functionally just a $60 tech demo for Scarlet and Violet. It's a far less infuriating tech demo than Sword and Shield, but is no less iterative and replaceable. Frankly, the only things this game has going for it at this point are its unique catching mechanics, we'll see how long that lasts, and the fact that its ride Pokemon control better than Miraidon. I'll be honest, Arceus and the Gen 9 games are both difficult for me to recommend to fans of the series that have been burned by the nosedive in quality from Ultra Sun and Moon onward. But whereas I can tell those fans that are interested in Gen 9 to just wait for a patch, I can't really afford Arceus the same courtesy. All I can tell fans interested in Arceus is to wait for Gen 9 to be patched instead. Or wait for Generation 10. Maybe I'll eventually revisit this one and try to go a bit easier on it, but as it stands now, Arceus is a middling Pokemon game that only manages to fire on one cylinder that's been swiftly made all but obsolete by a game that's fired on almost all cylinders just 10 months later. Sunbreak is an interesting beast to have to tackle here, because my overall thoughts on it have shifted pretty noticeably as time's gone on. At launch, Sunbreak managed to take a game that I certainly enjoyed quite a bit, but wasn't exactly head over heels for due to a really rocky launch, and unironically pushed it to the top of the series for me. The story felt complete out of the gate, the new and returning monsters were a treat to hunt, and the jump in difficulty made it feel like most monsters could feasibly try to keep up with Rise's insane movement options. All of that was topped off with afflicted monsters making for a fun and challenging post-game loop after they were teased at the tail end of the story. Just during its initial launch, Sunbreak managed to more than double my playtime with Rise, and is easily the most fun I've had with Monster Hunter in a long time. Then, everything changed when the title updates attacked. Back in my evidently controversial Title Update 1 video, I was pretty vocal about my distaste for how curious armor crafting and the gating of high-end weapon materials behind high and nondescript AR thresholds soured my post-game experience. And those complaints still hold true to this day. Piling more RNG onto a game that already has a sufficient amount of RNG in its core loop is just unnecessary, and comes off like the devs are trying to fix something that just isn't broken. At the very least, the new non-afflicted monsters were a blast to hunt, my personal favorites being Chaotic Gore Magala and Violet Mizutsune. But then we reach the Risen Elder Dragons, and yet another new problem rears its ugly head. It apparently wasn't enough to gate higher quality materials in a preset anomaly quest list behind increasingly higher AR thresholds, because now Risen Elder Dragons are locked behind MR gates higher than 100, with Teostra being the most egregious example at MR 140. Look, I get it. If you're an insanely diehard fan of the series or you just can't be bothered to play other games, you've already gone way above that threshold. But as someone who loves this series and doesn't want to be chained to it at all times like a gacha game, these increasingly high barriers to entry are just a punishment for wanting to play other shit. It's partially why I kept putting off my newer title update videos aside from catching COVID around the reveal of Title Update 2, and why I'll likely shelve those videos until Sunbreak stops getting updates. I love and will always appreciate what Day 1 Sunbreak did to completely reinvigorate my love for Rise, no doubt about that. But the way that title updates mucked up an otherwise perfect expansion for me can't be understated. Pokemon Violet is a game that I threw a lot of praise at in my first impressions video, and one I intend to throw more praise at in my full review later on. Despite all its glaring technical difficulties and paperclip-bound coding, it still managed to be the most fun I've had with Pokemon in ages, and easily crushes the majority of the 3DS and Switch era titles. Paldea's true open world is a joy to explore because new Pokemon continually string you along as you take in the sights, and the revamped Dex reward system only bolsters that desire to scour the region. The majority of new Pokemon designs are strong additions to the series, and there's a swath of new and returning quality of life additions like auto-healing with the press of one button and Arceus' move management. Terastallization is easily my favorite generational battle gimmick, since every Pokemon can take advantage of it. The bizarre hats aren't exactly my cup of tea, but it's certainly more appealing than blowing Pokemon up like balloons. But the aspect of Violet that I think is its biggest boon is its story and character writing. The cast feels extremely fleshed out and is populated with people you want to see on screen. Shocker, I know. Starfall Street, The Path of Legends, and The Way Home feel like they were scripted in a world where the Ultra titles and Sword and Shield never existed. A world where Scarlet and Violet were slated to be the true worthy follow-ups to Sun and Moon. And without getting into specifics, you can tell that the writers really loved Sun and Moon. It almost makes you wonder what the hell happened at that company for the past 6 years. The game isn't without its issues, of course. It is a mainline Pokemon game after all. Miraidon's movement upgrades pale in comparison to the ride Pokemon from Arceus, most gym tests feel like a bit of an afterthought, and the actual gym battles are a mixed bag in terms of team quality. And what are maybe the most glaring omissions are the lack of set mode and character customization options, especially considering that this game puts a lot of thematic emphasis on shaping your own experience. Pokemon Violet isn't a perfect game, by a long shot. I won't even attempt to convince you of that. But it's easily the best Pokemon experience I've had since Sun and Moon. And while I'm certainly not expecting Generation 10 to match it, it does have me the least bit hopeful of what's to come. I'll be honest, I didn't think I'd get to talk about this game in time for the end of the year, but shoutouts to my friend Gump for hooking me up with a copy over the holidays. I appreciate it greatly, mate. Crisis Core is an odd game to me. It's the only Final Fantasy that I could bring myself to play growing up, despite being surrounded by family that's played Final Fantasy 1 and 10 religiously. I would eventually go back and beat the PSP version of 4, and I stayed with the Switch port of 7 long enough to hit the credits after Remake piqued my interest. And I remember enjoying Crisis Core a lot. It's the only game in the series to this day that manages to worm its way back into my head time and time again. Needless to say, I'm relieved that Crisis Core Reunion kept the majority of that experience intact, while reworking the jank that desperately needed a glow-up. Your normal attacks actually combo now! Zack dashes towards the nearest enemy rather than swinging at the air. Your commands are tucked away in a shortcut window, Kingdom Hearts style, and you can stockpile limit breaks. And better than that, you can skip the limit break cutscenes. Forget the revamped visuals, forget Zack's new VA, This is the biggest change Reunion brings to the table, and it is massive. Game-changing even. I barely remember engaging with side missions in the original, but now I'm blasting through them every chance I get because I just want an excuse to fight more. I already know that the plot is unchanged from the original, so I'm definitely not in any rush to see the book close on Zack's story again. And that just means I can take my sweet time re-experiencing why I enjoy this game oh so much. I'm not sure if I'll ever make a dedicated video on Crisis Core. I just don't think I'm quite that passionate about it or the rest of the compilation to justify it. But if nothing else, I'm glad that I could take this chance to gush, even briefly, about this gem of a PSP game that was finally given the newer, stronger wings that it deserved after so many years. And now, we've nearly reached the end of the road. There's only one game left that I've yet to talk about. If you'll recall my words from the intro, it's the one that I plucked from this video's otherwise chronological composition to save for last. Not just because it's predictably my game of the year, but because it's a fitting place for a title that closes the door on a trilogy that contains some of my favorite games of all time. It certainly wasn't there at the beginning. I'm not quite sure I believe the series lead when he says that this series was all planned out from the start. But I do know one thing for certain. Xenoblade Chronicles 3, from the outset, seeks to proclaim the end, and in my opinion, it does so masterfully. Ionios is a breathtaking and eclectic place, a mangled marriage of Xenoblade 1 and 2's worlds. The prospect of exploring this new world is enticing, but it's made very clear from the outset that this isn't the ideal future that Shulk and Rex strove towards in their respective journeys. A world where war is never-ending and a natural part of life, and the lifespan of those who survive long enough only caps out at 10 years is just far too cruel a fate for the Bionis and all rest to meet. And this unholy matrimony is even exemplified in the design of the areas that you traverse. While Milik Meadows meshes the Bionis leg and Gormod in a mostly seamless way, aside from the Kamos guidepost sinking into the cliffside, other areas like Erythia Sea didn't integrate quite as gracefully in my opinion. That's not to say that they look unappealing, just unnatural. Like this fusion wasn't meant to be. Or perhaps that their merging might have done more harm than good. And fusion is actually a pretty defining theme when it comes to just about everything in this game, not just the environments. Your party is comprised of races from 1 and 2, and their unique power interlink can only be achieved by fusing a person from each side together. Half of the arts a character can use are pulled from classes of the opposing nation, and the effects of Kevesi and Agnian arts can be combined to perform aptly named fusion arts. Hell, this game even integrates the different art cooldowns from 1 and 2. So if you have a preference for one game's battle system over the other, you can just focus on playing a character or class that are tied to that game. There's so much more that works to bring all of the series' key aspects together in harmony. And while I understand that might make Xenoblade 3 feel overwhelming at points, I can't help but appreciate how committed the devs were to this approach. Naturally, I can't talk about Xenoblade 3 without at least touching on its soundtrack, but I've noticed that this game's score in particular has received a fair bit of criticism compared to the other games as far as area themes are concerned. I do at least somewhat understand why. A lot of the tracks used just don't give off the same energy as Gower Plains or More Ardain. And while this might be wishful thinking, or at worst flat out coping on my part, I'd like to think that was at least somewhat intentional. Going back to my musings about the setting, it's clear that at least to some extent, this world shouldn't be the way that it is. It's functionally frozen in time, stuck in an unsettling, self-destructive samsara. Ionios is the antithesis of the idyllic crossover everyone was hoping for, and as such, I think the subdued and sometimes even somber tones that 3's compositions opt for work in its favor, even if that comes at the cost of not being as memorable. There's so much more that I could spend hours gushing about with this game. The way that it strives to ensure that every member is given a plethora of standout interactions with the rest of the cast that helps the group feel more tight-knit than your average JRPG party. Or how the optional hero quests manage to feel like a natural part of the main story despite the majority of them not being mandatory. But this video needs to end eventually, and I'd much rather save my full thoughts for a proper review down the line. Not right away, mind you, but I do intend on following through on this in due time. I may not have gotten to branch out quite as far as I would have liked this year in terms of the games that I've played, but I can't act like I'm dissatisfied with what I did get to play either. And the start of 2023 is looking pretty promising as far as I'm concerned. Atlas finally decided that making more money isn't beneath them anymore, and is bringing P3P and P4G to modern platforms not named Steam. Certainly took them long enough, but it's clear that they don't want to make that much money, unfortunately. And I mean, come on. Do I even need to tell you how excited I am for the Battle Network Legacy Collection? This has been a satisfying, if incredibly eventful year. And here's to another good one in 2023.